So welcome. We're going to begin. I want to make a few comments by way of welcoming our very special guest, Wanda Denson-Low, who is one of our own graduates who we're enormously proud of and who is helping us continue to celebrate and observe Trailblazers, and also will, I'm sure, give you all some really wonderful insights that will be of help to you as you think through your careers and where you're heading. First comment is that our law school for 116 years has been a gateway of opportunity for people from all sorts of backgrounds. And that has always been the case. Somebody recently said to me that if we were going to have an event or a program for people who were first in something or trailblazers, that we would be nothing but celebrating trailblazers and pioneers. And I said, well, the problem is, but the fact is that that is really one of the aspects of our great law school that sets us apart. Some of you have been hearing me say and congratulate Harvard Law School, for example, that you may have heard about this, has recently been celebrating its first black woman editor-in-chief of its law review. And that's wonderful, that should be celebrated. But I also say to my dear friend and classmate Martha Minow, their dean, what took you so long? Mary Johnson-Low was class of 1952, who led our Brooklyn Law Review in 1952, and she was the second black district United States judge in the United States, the second African-American woman appointed to the federal judiciary. Dorothy Chin Brandt of the class of 74 was the first Asian-American woman judge in New York and the state's first Asian-American public official. David Dinkins, a class of 1956, served as the first and to date the only African-American mayor of New York City. Percy Sutton, class of 1950, served as the Manhattan Borough president between 1966 and 77 at that time, and he was New York State's highest-ranking African-American elected official up to that point. Benjamin Ward, class of 55, the first and only to date African-American to become New York City Police Commissioner. Herman Badillo, class of 1954, the nation's first Puerto Rican-born congressman, and he opened the door even wider for Latinos. I know at LALSA, our Latin American Law Student Association annual dinner, will be celebrating many of those leaders from this law school, and earlier this year we had a wonderful exhibit here of luminarias, including many of our own graduates from the Latin American community who were women of that heritage who had gone on to achieve great things. One of my personal favorites is John Caro, class of 52. He's my parents' next-door neighbor, and he's the first Puerto Rican to be named the New York State Supreme Court Appellate Division, where he served as an associate justice for 15 years. The New York described him as a legendary justice. And prior to becoming a judge, Caro served as the assistant to New York City Mayor Robert Wagner, and he also served as director of the Mayor's Information Center and his liaison to all New York City social services. He was the very first Puerto Rican to be assistant to the mayor of the city of New York. And he also was in private law practice for many years in a very successful firm. And one of his law partners was Mary Johnson-Low, who I started off this list. There's also Peter Tom, class of 1975, the Associate Justice in the New York State Appellate Division, who has a long list of firsts in the legal arena and notable achievement in another venue as the first Asian American to win the New York City Golden Gloves Boxing Championship. So we're tough in every category. And you know, the list goes on and on. Jeanette Brill, class of 1908, went on to found the Brooklyn Women's Bar Association, became a judge of the Magistrates and Domestic Relations Courts, and she was a leading suffragette. So, you know, right from the beginning, this is nothing really new at the law school. And then also, who is, remind me, the youngest Asian elected official, Wang in New Jersey? Yeah. What is his first name? Jonathan Wang, yeah. So, you know, I go back to 1908 and fast forward to the class of 2017, 2018. We keep up this tradition. Okay, so I went through that because, you know, we're continuing by way of Trailblazers, and our speaker today really embodies something that we've been noticing, and I think that most of our graduates feel. No matter where they come from, no matter what their circumstances, when they get to Brooklyn Law School, they work very, very hard. Now, all of you in this room, I know that resonates with you because that's what you're doing right now. And when they leave, they have this feeling that they cannot imagine having a better legal education without denigrating any other place. And I think that many people graduate from many of our great law schools in this country have that same feeling. But our graduates think that they've really got a good, outstanding education, and it's really certainly second to none. And that while they were here, their hard work enabled them to take advantage of great teaching, to participate in a very active scholarly community that sharpened their intellectual, critical thinking skills, and they gained terrific experience. And that combination gave them both confidence and the ability to figure things out, which upon graduation was noticed, and then throughout their careers stood them in good stead. And this certainly, and I've been reading some of the things you may have been from articles about you where you made some comments, and you made comments very similar to that in terms of, you know, what helped you in your career, and that your hard work and your confidence was noticed and it stood out. So I feel like what I'm saying actually rings true across our alumni body. Wanda Denson-Low is a remarkable graduate of this law school who did her undergraduate work at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and she was recruited into Union Carbide for a legal position working in the intellectual property and patent area, achieved a great deal at the Hughes Corporation, one of the largest great air and space and defense corporations in the United States, and became, in the 1980s, the first minority chief patent counsel, or the top patent counsel for a corporation in the United States. The United States history is a real groundbreaker there. And eventually concluded her in-house corporate career with a long stint at the Boeing Corporation, where she held a number of incredibly big, groundbreaking senior posts, again as a first. Her many community and bar association and legal distinctions are enormous. I know that something that she's particularly proud of, that we have been the beneficiary of, is that she serves as the vice chairman of RPI in Troy, New York, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I was once admitted and still have somewhere the RPI Math and Science pin. So I was one of those kind of, you know, high school kids in New York State. And the work that she's doing there is incredibly important and very, very rewarding. She and her husband, Ron Lowe, have been enormously generous to this school in supporting scholarships. And I think I'm allowed to say this, so I'm not going to look into her eyes, but she made it possible for many of you who are in this room, I think, to join those in a bus to go up to Troy yesterday and hear Chief Justice Roberts give a talk. How many folks in this room did that yesterday? Okay, so why don't we give Ron and Wanda a round of applause of thanks for all they've already done. Okay, before I wear out my welcome, let's turn to the main event here. And Wanda, how did you become you? I mean, you now, I mean, give us a little bit of your background, you know, before college and then up through college. I mean, what is your background like, and how did you evolve up to that point?
Well, I grew up in Queens. Bronx High School of Science, for those of you that might be familiar with that. From there, I went to RPI. I have an undergraduate degree in chemistry. And much to my parents' chagrin, who they wanted me to be a doctor, I chose to be a lawyer instead. I think coming to Brooklyn Law School was a conscious choice. I'd gotten accepted to a lot of other law schools, but during that time, student loans were an issue. And Brooklyn Law School had guaranteed you the same tuition that you started with all through your 3 years. And as a result, this was a bargain 30-something years ago. My tuition at Brooklyn Law School was less than my tuition at RPI. So I paid $3,500 tuition, and I will say that that was, at the time, a significant driver, because at least the cap on student loan then was about $5,000 a year, so it meant I could live at home, pay my tuition, and still have a little money left over for books. And that was the primary reason I chose Brooklyn Law School over some other notable schools. But I don't think it was a bad decision. And I do think all of you should be proud of being from this school. And there will be those out in the legal profession. I ran into one the other day on the telephone, who when they ask you what law school you went to and they tell you, they give you what I call the look, where it's, but you know, I looked at this gentleman who's 71 years old, and yes, he works at a prominent firm, but he's still working. And I retired before my 60th birthday. So I think the Brooklyn Law School education is one that enabled that to be a very real possibility for me. So I'm very grateful for the education I had here.
Well, that's wonderful, and you certainly haven't hung up your spurs. You're still very, very busy and engaged. So, how did you end up in the in-house corporate world?
Well, one of the things that I would encourage all of you to do is have a strategy. So the year that I graduated, which was 1981, there were something like 36,000 law school graduates that year, and there were only about 20,000 jobs. So as I began to look at the classes who were ahead of me, and there were students who a year out, 2 years out, still didn't have gainful employment, I really needed to come up with a strategy as to how I was going to get a job. So I looked at what was unique about me and my experience and my background, and it really was at the time that I had a chemistry undergraduate degree from a fairly well-known STEM institution. At that time, patent law had not really taken off yet. It really didn't take off until probably the late 80s. But I thought that rather than going to a law firm, there weren't a whole lot of women in law firms, and there certainly weren't a lot of people of color in law firms back in those days. And so I decided that I would try and join a corporation, because many of the alumni who came back to school, though they may have started at law firms, they all at about the 7th or 8th year, if they didn't make partner, tried to jump into corporate work at that point. And so my strategy was I would start at a corporation, be able to learn and understand the product, the culture, and what gave me the leg up was corporations hired intellectual property lawyers. And so that was my strategy. I did the U.S. Attorney clinical internship here, and my second year summer, I was able to get a patent internship at Union Carbide Corporation, which at that time was at 270 Park in Manhattan. And I did well enough that they actually offered me a permanent job a year before graduation. So I took it.
So you really didn't follow
the traditional
path. You carved your own path.
Well, I had to strategize in that everybody was doing the same thing. Because there were no jobs, law review students were looking at legal aid jobs, believe it or not, jobs in the DA's office. And so you had a lot of people competing for the same group of jobs. And so what I said was, I'm gonna not compete in that same genre, but really look for what's unique about me and my skills and develop a strategy around how I was gonna get a job using those unique skills.
And you decided on patent law, trademark, copyright
Right,
as an area because it fit. But your science background is chemistry originally, right?
correct.
How much adapting or on-the-job learning in terms of the type of technology that Hughes and Boeing, I assume it was aerospace, electronics, that sort of thing?
Well, with technology, at RPI you learn the basics. I had some electrical engineering courses, mechanical engineering, physics, calculus, all the basics that any good scientist would have. And so I knew what textbooks I had to look at. If there was an invention that was maybe outside of my bailiwick. But really, I think having that good basic understanding of technology enabled you to learn enough to write the patent application, to handle the licensing agreement, or whatever else the company needed you to do. And I think getting that good foundation here in that basic contracts class and real property, those are the things that save you when you go on to private practice, wherever that is, in a company, a law firm, at a nonprofit. Understanding the basics really well provides that solid foundation.
And in many respects, though, you know, it wasn't all a bed of roses. I'm sure that the corporate day-to-day environment for you as a woman and as a minority woman was not, you know, we're all mindful of this movie, Hidden Figures, which is a very stylized Hollywood version, I'm sure, of what was going on. But thanks to the magic of the internet and Camille, I'm looking at a picture much later than the start of your career, where you were already a big shot at Boeing. You're a big shot at Boeing Corporation. In fact, you're on the executive council of the organization. And I'm looking at this picture, which I'm sure is in the 2000s when it was taken. And you're standing in the middle of a group. You can't probably do this, but there is Wanda Denson-Low in the middle of a bunch of white guys.
Me and the fellow.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's 20, 30, 25 years after you started. So what was it like? What were the challenges? And what was your secret sauce to success despite those challenges?
Well, I think RPI, the ratio of males to females, when I went from 74 to 78, was about 50 to 1. 50 males for every female. Out of an entering class of about 1,000 students, including foreign students, there were less than 100 persons of color. So you're used to standing out, and at RPI, I was used to dealing with a bunch of men, because that's all there was, primarily. I could be in a lecture hall of 300 people and be the only woman and the only person of color in the room. So I think you learn resilience, you learn how to collaborate, you learn how to get along with people. And those were skills that I think took me to aerospace, because there I was again, surrounded by a bunch of men. I think that, was it challenging? Absolutely. Were there issues? Of course there were. But I think that my attitude was, I couldn't change who I was, nor did I want to. So I had to figure out how to succeed in spite of their preconceived notions of who I was and what I could do. So I was the person who always showed up really early. I stayed later than everybody else. I was the first one in, the last one to leave, and I was always at the top of my game. Did it take a lot? Absolutely, because I also had 2 children and a husband. And though my son, who's sitting in this room, didn't really understand
don't out him.
why I was tired all the time, But as a kid, I made 85% of his games, and our deal was if I was in the state of California, I was making his game. It sometimes meant I had to leave the office at 2 to get it to his game at 3 o'clock, bring him home, and I would go back to the office, or I would work until sometimes 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. But I think that the sacrifice was well worth it in that he turned out not to be an axe murderer, despite the fact that his mother was a crazy person most of the time.
Oh, Cameron, this is bad. I'm sorry I've wrought this on you. He's a good sport. Well, you know, you anticipated sort of questions that are on a lot of people's minds, because for a lot of people, and it's not just women, it's certainly not just women, they want to have purpose and meaning in their life, and you hear a lot of people talking about work-life balance, whatever that is, right? I've never really figured that out.
Whatever that is.
You want to comment on that, because I'm sure that's on people's minds. How do you have a successful career and a meaningful, worthwhile life?
It usually means you're tired all the time. I think that for me and my husband, it was very important. Our children were everything. And I didn't want my child being raised by nannies and all that. So we did it together. My husband's also a lawyer, and we, you know, whoever could do whatever was needed, whether it was taking them to the doctor or whatever, it would be whoever could do it that day, that's who did it, and we never kept score. The kids were our primary focus, and we made the work situation work. And I think that as a result, I don't have a lot of hobbies. I didn't have a lot of free time. I was either working or with my children. But I think that sacrifice of free time was well worth it, to make sure that they were, you know, compassionate human beings with understanding how important it was to work hard, and also understanding that despite that they were somewhat privileged, that they had a responsibility to their communities. So our children came with us to soup kitchens, and we did food basket drives. I took them as we walked precincts for various candidates. And Cameron learned at 5 years old how to knock on somebody's door, because in certain neighborhoods they wouldn't open the door for us. But when they looked through the peephole and saw a 5-year-old, Cameron could stand up and say, "Hi, I'm Cameron Low. I'm here for the candidate from," and they would go, "What?" And then we would come running up. So he learned a lot as a child, but we took him everywhere. And I think that those sacrifices were well worth it, because he doesn't take things for granted, and he realizes how fortunate he was to be in our family, and that had nothing to do with him. That had to do with the higher being who chose us as his family. So I think balancing is hard, and I think anyone who tells you that it's not hard is lying. But I think the sacrifice is well worth it, and you learn how to, I remember taking my children to work because Ron was in trial, the babysitter got sick, and I had to go to work. So I was able to show him how to use the photocopy machine, and he actually photocopied documents for me while I was at my office, and he was probably like 8. So I think you integrate your children into whatever it is you're doing. When I had to travel, you know, I'd get out the globe and have a conversation about what foreign country I had to go to for a couple of days, and give him a geography lesson at his level. I had to go to India. I had the dubious honor of going to India 12 times in about a year and a half on some litigation. And I always got sick without fail every time I went. And he kept saying, "Why are you going to India all the time, Mom?" And I said, well, the only thing he could relate to at about 7 was Jungle Book and Bagheera. So I said, well, you know, Bagheera needs a lawyer, so I have to go there and kind of help out this panther. And at least at that time, he bought it. So
until now, he thought that was it. Don't mention anything about Santa Claus, because you're going to break his heart. So, okay, there's a theme here. So success at work and career comes from primarily work, hard work. Success in life and with family comes from hard work. It's not easy. I mean, you enjoy it. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about diversity in a different way. You know, I'm very personally committed to this concept, and it's one of the reasons that I'm here at this great law school. But I believe that diversity is not only, obviously, of all the morals and values that you think about applying to business, it's the easiest one to make the case for. It's the right thing. And it's especially the right thing for law, because law plays such an important part in our structure of our civilization society that if there isn't equal opportunity for people to have the advantages of law, to be lawyers, then the system is illegitimate. But it's not only the right thing, it's the smart thing to do. And I wonder if you could comment on your perspectives of why diversity is important. And you know, you can agree or disagree, but why, what is it? Why does diversity make a difference? Why should we strive for it as a goal? Both, you know, from a values point of view, but in a practical sense.
There's a story that a lawyer that I know came up with that I'll share with all of you that I think illustrates why diversity is important. So in this story, there's a general counsel who has a very complex and challenging legal problem. And he, of course, has a cadre of lawyers at his disposal. So he calls in the first lawyer, who happens to be a white male, and explains the complex legal challenge and says, well, how do you see this issue? And to make a long story short, I'm going to use some symbolism, but the lawyer says, well, this problem looks like an M to me. An M will stand for some aspect of the law. So he calls the next lawyer, who also happens to be a white male, explains the situation and says, well, how do you see this situation? And this lawyer comes back and says, well, I too see it as an M. So this goes on through about 8 or 9 lawyers. And finally, he calls in a woman and explains the situation to her and says, well, how do you see this problem? And she says, I see it as a W, upside down M. So this continues, and he brings in a person of color and asks them the same question, and they say, well, I see it as an E. Now think about E, M, W. And so to make a long story short, if you've got a group of lawyers, all kind of from the same schools, you know them, the Ivies, and they all see the same situation, they're from the same background, they all see the problem the same way, you're missing out on being able to deal with the problem completely as a lawyer, because you don't have people from other backgrounds who can see other facets of that same problem and enable you as the general counsel to come up with a better solution to deal with all facets, whether it's an M, a W, or an E. And so I think, for me at least, you've got this diversity of thought in that people from different backgrounds view situations differently. And you need all of that brain power to come up with an adequate solution. And so there's a real business reason to have people of diverse backgrounds. Now, I can tell you in my organization at Boeing, I had 3 or 4 vice presidents and probably about 1,500 people reporting to me. We were the most diverse organization in the entire company. All of my vice presidents were women, which was unheard of in aerospace. And one of my vice presidents, the VP of Internal Audit, was African American. And we kicked butt and took names. We were the most successful organization in our corporation by any measure that anybody wanted to use. And I think it was because we had an organization energized because we had all these different people working on solutions to tough compliance issues, to tough audit issues, to tough import-export issues, as Boeing was the largest exporter in the United States. And even to sell commercial airplanes to certain countries, in some instances takes a signature of the President of the United States, believe it or not, to sell to China and other places. So I think diversity is something that I believed in very early on in my career before it was popular, like back in the late 80s and 90s. And we, whether I was at Hughes as Vice President and Assistant General Counsel or General Counsel of Boeing's $32 billion defense business, we walked the talk. So what we said was important was what we did. And I think that the results that we achieved as an organization, because nobody does it alone, I had great people working for me, the smartest people that I could find.
Yeah.
Yeah, the work speaks for itself.
That's great. And so, you know, adding to that, diversity means that you're not depriving yourself of the most talented people on your team.
Exactly.
Because of some artificial barriers or selection process. So that's number one. It strengthens you by going on the merits and having these different perspectives. But also, it enables you to compete in the world as the world exists, because the world is outside is incredibly diverse. So, you know, if you're in a law firm and you get invited to do a corporate pitch, and you show up at the corporate headquarters, you know what I'm going to say. If you have, your pitch team is 4 white men, you're going to walk into a room, and there are going to be 2 women of color, you know, 1 man and maybe a robot or something. But you know, you are not going to be hired if you are not reflecting, and corporate America is now ahead of law firms. So it's just something to bear in mind. Now, it also takes, we hear a lot about mentoring, and we hear about how you break through some of these various glass ceilings, but that also takes some work. And a lot of students are very interested in mentoring, but I'm always hopeful that they get the message that it takes work on their part to get full advantage. It's not just something that's, you know, mentoring experience, it's handed to you, it's a two-way street. I was reading about one particular situation where you served as a career mentor, you were the in-house client, but you actually found a young man who was not yet a partner at a Chicago firm, and you became it took a lot of work on your part, and I'm sure you scared the hell out of him a couple of times. Can you talk about that experience a little bit?
You know, there weren't a lot of people of color in the intellectual property field, and actually a friend of mine, a colleague from Union Carbide, I was with Hughes, told me about an African American lawyer who was an intellectual property lawyer in a firm in Chicago. And literally, you know, I was like, wow, because for so long I was one of the few. And so I picked up the phone and called him up and told him that he should come to California to meet me. So we had lunch and actually became very good friends. It turns out that his daughter actually went to college with my son, and they knew each other. We found that out much later. But I started mentoring him and talking to him about his law firm, which I knew a lot about, some of the partners there who I also knew, and the fact that you know, he was a University of Michigan undergraduate, electrical engineering. I think he had gone to University of Michigan Law School as well. Very credentialed, somewhat introverted. And I said, if you ever want to make partner at this firm, you need to step up your game. And so I worked with him. I gave him about $500,000 worth of business to start. Within 3 years, he had about $4 to $5 million worth of business from me. I went with him to his partners and made sure that they understood that the reason the firm was getting this work was because of him, and they should be treating him well. So he did eventually become partner. And this story was written up in the Wall Street Journal, I think back in the early 90s. And eventually I talked him into moving to another firm because I felt the firm he was currently at, which is well known, so I won't mention the name, wasn't treating him very well. And as a result, he moved to another firm and took my business with him. So he eventually became chief patent counsel at Raytheon at one point, which is in the top 5
Huge, yeah.
aerospace and defense contractors in the US. And I still talk to him on occasion. He's actually living in Houston, and he is married to someone who is a astronaut. She's a twin, and she's a PhD physicist, and she's African American.
Wow. Well, but you made a difference, and it must be very gratifying to you, but it's also, you're helping move things along, and I hope that more people kind of follow that example. I think one of the reasons our students can feel empowered and that their education is second to none is because we have been and are so diverse, because I think it really gives you an edge when you graduate. And
I think it does, and whether you're, I have helped probably about 500 RPI students in the last 4 to 5 years get jobs at Boeing, summer internships, and permanent jobs. And what's interesting, Boeing recruited maybe about 10 people a year originally. When I got back involved with the university, most of them were male students. And typically what's happened is during that period, we upped the game. Probably half of the students recruited now are women and minorities. And part of that is, I think, an opportunity and a responsibility for all of us to give back to the communities that we're from, and being able to help all students of all colors from your university get a leg up in what is still a difficult employment environment, whether you're an engineer or a lawyer. I think it's important for alumni to do all they can to help.
so were you complete control over your whole career, following a charted course, or did luck or serendipity or surprise play any part of it? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think I learned we had a chairman emeritus at Hughes who came to the office every day. He was 90 years old, I'm not kidding. Smart as a whip. He came in at 7, he left at 6 every day. He still had an office. And he took Hughes from being a small fledgling radar systems manufacturer to about a $20 billion company before he retired. And I met him, I interviewed for a director level job, which should have been maybe an interview with a vice president, and that was it. Well, they made me interview with the CEO, 2 executive vice presidents, 4 senior vice presidents, and this CEO emeritus for this director job. And we all know why that was. So, I met with him for a 2.5-hour interview, and he was quite cantankerous. He said a lot of things that probably would have gotten the company sued today, but I survived, kept my composure, thanked him for his time. He said things like, "Young woman, I have shoes older than you are." And he probably did. And so he called me at 7:30 the next morning. I was at the office. He was surprised, and he called me back to his office and he said, "I was really an ass to you." And I said nothing. And he said, well, you're not saying anything. And I said, well, my mother told me when elders speak, you know, I should let them speak. And since you're speaking the truth, why would I?
Oh,
And so he said, well, you held your composure, you took it on the chin, and I was surprised that you were in so early. And I said, well, if you didn't think I was here, why would you call me at 7:30 in the morning? And so he said, well, you know, despite what everyone thinks, I'm going to call the CEO and tell him you should get this job. And I did get the job. And he became a mentor of mine after that. And he said something to me, which is, opportunity happens when chance meets a prepared mind. So if you think about that, you know, there are opportunities out there every day, and it's up to us to really be prepared. I have had jobs that I had no clue I was going to get, and someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, you know what, we think you should try out for this job. And I was a vice president of HR for 2 years, a job I would not have chosen. But it was a job that ended up getting me the general counsel job for Boeing's defense business. I was the vice president of HR for that business for 2 years. The man who was head of that business, Jim Aubaugh, was heading up this business, eventually headed up Boeing's commercial airplane business. I got to know him, did some innovative things in HR, and when we got into legal trouble with the US government and the Air Force suspension and debarment official, he said, Wanda's a lawyer, I want her to be my new general counsel. And so I think I was ready. The opportunity presented itself. And that is something that I want all of you to think about. There will be many opportunities that may just happen that you may say, well, gee, I never thought about doing this, or I certainly would not have thought about being head of HR. But it was an opportunity at a new company where I was not known, to get to know senior people and to give them an opportunity to see what I could do. And so it turned out to be the absolute best thing. I didn't choose to be the head of compliance. I was happy doing my general counsel job. And the CEO of Boeing called me and said, hey, we're in trouble again. You're always the person who manages to get the company out of trouble. We need you to head global compliance. And as the head of global compliance for Boeing, I did not report through the law department. I reported directly to the CEO. I was a senior VP along with the general counsel of the corporation, much to his chagrin. I had, you know, internal audit as part of my bailiwick as well, and that was not, again, a job I sought out. It was one where the chairman came to me. And so I do think that being ready when opportunity knocks is important, which means the work doesn't stop once you graduate. You've got to understand what you're working in, read the trades for whatever industry you're in. In aerospace, it was reading Defense News, Aviation Week, understanding what deals were coming in the pipeline, what other competitors were doing, because as a lawyer, you can help your company look ahead, and being proactive is what gets you noticed. Just doing what's expected does not. So the work is not going to stop once you graduate. The learning is going to continue. Read Harvard Business Review. Read Fortune magazine if you're going to be a business lawyer. Read the trades for whatever field you're going into, because that's going to make the difference in helping you stand out.
so you said yes a lot, took the baton that was handed, thrust at you, and ran with it. How do you know when to say no?
You know, I was scared to death at every opportunity, and I would come home and talk to my husband. We'd have a family powwow, as we called it. And I would talk to my kids, because the first 6 months in a new job, you're not going to be around a lot. You're going to be working a lot of hours. Interestingly enough, my sons very early would say, well, Mom, just go for it. I don't think they had a clue what was really going on. But they were very encouraging, as well as my husband. And I think that though I was scared, which is normal, with something new and a lot more responsibility, I think you get over those the anxiety and the jitters, and you realize, you know what, you can do it. And you are prepared. And if you've prepared well throughout your career, you will be prepared for these opportunities that come up. And so there wasn't a time when I said no. Well, I should say when I retired, my chairman didn't want me to retire. And in fact, he offered me lots of other jobs and lots of money to stay. But I felt that it was time. You know, I wanted to have more choice in my life, to spend more time with my children, my husband, and to be able to read a book for pleasure, as opposed to reading to educate myself on some area of the law, to be able to travel to places I wanted to go versus to some hellhole that the company was sending me to. And so I think that it was the right decision for me to retire when I did, when I still had my health and I was young enough to really still enjoy now having a hobby, being able to read books for pleasure, being able to travel where I wanted, when I wanted, versus being on someone else's clock.
Wow. So how about a different kind of no? How does somebody, when they're in a law firm or in a corporation, you know, faced with doing something they don't believe is right, or they spot an issue, how do you handle something like that, especially if you're a younger person just starting out, you know? How can you tell whether something's of the kind where you should actually draw the line?
You know, I think that's a personal decision. I think one of the reasons that I was successful was that people knew I was a straight arrow. If there were business people, and for those of you who are going to work for companies, there are business people who want to do shady things because they're graded on how much business they can bring in. And if they do something shady and it means the revenue goes up, you know, they're going to be inclined to do it. And so I was the person who always said, no, you can't do that, but you can do this. Here's another way to solve the problem without running afoul of the law. And I think that having ethics, having a moral compass, having personal values, and quite frankly, having your family, which helps keep you grounded. I think there are people who let their jobs go to their heads. For me, it was hard to take myself all that seriously when, you know, my kids were little. I had spit up all over my clothes all the time. And so you're grounded, and your family keeps you grounded and makes sure, you know what, you're not all that great. You're just my mom. And so I think that having that moral compass is important because we all see people, and I've known a Boeing executive, in fact, too, who went to jail. And I was the person calling corporate going, you know, I don't think you guys should be doing this. And I was told several times to mind my own business. It was being handled, you know, at a different level, and those two executives went to jail. So I think that
Yeah, this is not a hypothetical situation.
no, this is
You
not
do
a
face
hypothetical
this.
situation. So I do think that it is important to understand what your values are going in, being confident in those, and making sure that no one makes you do something that you're uncomfortable with or that goes against your values.
Well, I'm about ready, not quite, but about ready to open it up for some questions from the students. But I'll just turn and ask you, before we do that, while they're thinking about their questions, for a couple of very more granular, hard-headed, practical kind of questions. So first, job interview. What's one, advice, one big do and one big don't?
One big do is making sure you've done your homework on who you're going to interview with. Know as much about the firm, company, whatever, as the individual interviewing you is going to know. Have prepared some really great questions which show that you've done your homework on the employer you're trying to get a job with. One big don't at the end of the interview say, I don't have any questions.
Okay. I thought a big don't is like, I'm not leaving here until you give me a job offer.
Well, I'm assuming.
I just read that. No, I just read that, and they had to call security to get rid of the guy, so I don't think he had a job.
Questions are your opportunity to impress people with what you've learned about that company or that
Good advice.
employer.
Okay, on the job, a big, working, how to stand out, a big do and a big don't.
I think a big do is understanding the culture of the organization that you're working with. Be observant. Do people come in early? Do they stay late? What do they wear? Who are the successful people? And what are the things that you think are unique about those people who are successful in that organization? Those are the things you want to emulate. If people come in late and leave early, then you want to come in early and stay late. And so I do think understanding the environment and the culture you're in will help you understand what it takes to stand out.
Okay. Questions? These aren't really lost. Cameron, you don't get to ask a question. Okay. I think he's going to ask, what were you thinking? It's great. Anybody have a question? Yeah.
I know you touched a little bit on, I guess, how to stay fresh. Okay. I know you touched a little bit about how to stay fresh within your industry. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more, especially like being in the IP field? Things have changed so drastically over the past years and dealing with competitors and stuff like that. Can you get a little bit more, I guess, into detail about that situation?
Well, I think when you're in practice, what happens is law firm people send you things all the time. All the law firms have newsletters in different areas of practice that'll tell you what are the new facets of the law. Most bars have, at least in California, continuing legal education. You figure out what the trades are in your industry. And so everyone says, well, I don't know how to figure out what those were. So I did an experiment, my RPI background. I was speaking to a group of lawyers in Pittsburgh last year, and I knew someone would ask me that question. So I went on Google. I pretended to be a real estate lawyer, pretended to be an insurance lawyer, and said, let me see how long it takes me using Google just to find out what the trades are in real estate law and insurance law. It took me 15 minutes. There are magazines and periodicals in every specialty that are considered the trades of the industry. I mentioned Aviation Week and Defense News for the aerospace industry. I think Harvard Business Review has some of the best articles about leadership. You would be surprised at how many CEOs read Harvard Business Review. How many CEOs read Fortune magazine, which is a pretty easy read. You can get a kind of summary of what's happening across a lot of various industries. Why would you say that's important to know? Well, if I'm in aerospace and I'm thinking about venturing into a new business, right, it would be important to know what's going on in those synergistic areas that are synergistic to my business. And when I sit down with a business person and being able to say, well, I know that so-and-so within this industry we're thinking about have already merged. So that's off the table, but here are some other candidates, businesses that we may be able to look at. And what that does is the business person goes, wow, she really understands our market, what we're trying to do. And that's where this learning continues, because it takes work to be ahead of the business people. My claim to fame was I was always 6 months ahead of where the chairman was going. So by the time he told the rest of the corporation this is what we were going to do, my organization was already doing it. And they noticed that. So I think that you've got to understand not just the law, but you've got to understand the business you're in. If you're working for a nonprofit, understanding if that nonprofit gets federal aid and whether or not that federal aid is about to be cut based on the budgetary process that's coming up. That could be important. So that's where expanding that base of knowledge beyond just the law is really important.
I would just add to the reading list, or the other thing is, we're in a global world. It's a cliche, but it helps us to somehow just be sure we know what overseas perspectives are, and also just use additional sources. So for example, I think the Financial Times, not only does it look really cool if you have it tucked under your arm, you know, because people say, oh, look at this person. They must be flying first class. But also The Economist, I think, is a particularly good read. There are many, many others, but I just think making sure you have an understanding of different international perspectives on business issues is very, very important. Who else has got a question? That was a great question. Yeah, go ahead.
At the beginning, you mentioned how diversity helps practice. As somebody who is disabled, how can I use that perspective in getting my foot into the door and use it as a plus instead of a stereotypical minus?
Well, I would look at, you know, there are a lot of companies who have touted their hiring of people of various abilities. And my thing would be, it's hard really to even come up with corporate policies when you yourself aren't necessarily suffering from that same ability, so that you know what are the things you would consider. So I would start to look at companies that have a history in that area, because you would be very valuable to them as a lawyer, bringing a unique perspective to the table. Because I would sit there sometimes doing, helping draft new policies for the corporation, and I'd be like, well, wait a minute, you know, I'm not of this particular community. Maybe we need to involve some other people to make sure as we draft these policies, we're thinking about things that may happen that were not intended, unintended consequences of certain policies. And so I was always somebody looking to kind of get the broadest cross-section of people to help us do something new within the company to make sure we thought about it from all angles. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hi. So you discussed working for a global compliance department, and you mentioned that it was something that you didn't have your eye on. Now, I feel like that's a stereotype that a lot of lawyers currently feel about a compliance that's not really something they are looking to do. Can you discuss a little bit about the lateral movement from legal counsel to compliance? And I know compliance is a current emerging field in law, so I know it's kind of like the new thing to do. Can you just talk about that and about the lateral move itself?
So I kind of learned about compliance the hard way when I was in Hughes's satellite business. Commercial satellites back in the early 90s were originally under Commerce Department. And with the stroke of a pen, it moved to the State Department. And though that may not seem like a huge issue, we had something like 35,000 technology licenses on satellites with various customers, because Hughes was one of the leading producers of satellites in the world. And overnight, those licenses were null and void, which meant that I had a satellite at the launch pad. Usually there's a systems check. They go through the technical people for the customer to say, okay, this is working, this is working. They couldn't do that. And we couldn't launch because we didn't have valid licenses. And so Hughes went through a huge issue with that, and that taught me a lot about compliance. And so when the compliance opportunity came up they said, gee, you have experience in all the problems we have, so you're the perfect person to fix it. I think I looked at compliance at the time, because it was outside of the law department, as something I wasn't sure I wanted to do. The then CFO of the company said, you're being invited to join the executive committee of the corporation, and you're going to turn it down. Are you nuts? And so I thought about it and kind of said, okay, maybe I will do this. And I think compliance is different at different companies. At a bank, it's very different than within aerospace. And so I think compliance could be a phenomenal area for people who are interested in that, depending on where that compliance is. Meaning, is it in a company that values that, or is it in a company where it's not valued?
You check the box and say
Right.
we did it.
So in aerospace, it was valued, because we had been the
critical.
poster child for the most consent decrees for violating export control laws. And so the chairman basically said, I'm giving you this job, and you need to set up a world-class compliance program. And we did. We went from being the poster child for bad behavior to being the poster child for having one of the best compliance programs in the United States within aerospace. And so I think it's just a question of compliance in what venue. If it's in a venue that values it, it's great, because I was freed to a certain extent from the law department, in that I was looked at as a business person and not just a lawyer. I had lawyers supporting my organization from the law department, but I was considered a business person, you know, P&L, profit and loss, budget, you know, head count, and so on. And that was a great experience, being able to run an organization of 12 or 1,500 people.
So this could be completely wrong, but it's my anecdotal sense that chief compliance officers and chief privacy officers, which is another relatively new in-house position, are disproportionately women. Is that true, or is that wrong? If it's wrong, we'll just move on.
I don't think they're disproportionately women, because having spoken at a lot of conferences, I think there are women in compliance, but I don't think the heads of compliance overwhelmingly are women, at least not in my
Okay.
experience.
Well, that's interesting. It's just, it seems, the reason I say that is that there's so many of our graduates who have found their way into the privacy roles, and they just seem to me to be a lot of women. But in any event, any other questions? We can take one or two more, and then we'll mix and mingle a little bit. Is that all right, Camille, if we take one or two? We have time for that before you all have to go out? Who's got another question? Jonathan, you had one earlier. Do we have any students who have a question? Yes, in the back.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. And my question is, from my research, a lot of compliance jobs do not require a law degree. They require a bachelor's or some prior experience. So I was wondering, what's the point for law students to pursue compliance if it's not a required law degree?
Well, I think it's different in different companies. And again, I think that it really depends. I wasn't going to be just a compliance officer. So I had 150 internal auditors reporting to me, and we did internal audit for the entire company. Okay, we were the audit arm of the company. We also had ethics. We had export compliance, and in export we probably did 2 million transactions a year. I also had global compliance and ran the internal risk management process for the entire corporation. So basically that meant every president and controller from the businesses within Boeing, we all had to get together once a year to do the internal risk management process, which is a requirement, under the SEC regulations to have a robust risk management process. So I think that, as I said, compliance at certain companies where it is a check the box exercise, it may not be the right environment, but at least within aerospace that's heavily regulated, particularly commercial airplane business, satellites, you've got ITAR restrictions and so on. I don't see how you do that job without, some kind of legal background.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, at my former law firm, one of my mentors, Tom Boggs, took under his wing, among many, many other people, Ron Brown, former Secretary of Commerce. And Ron Brown was a young associate, incredibly skilled, and not even a partner. And Tom brought in as a client the entire automobile industry of Japan, who were concerned about tariffs and restrictive trade at a time when the Japanese car industry was really challenging the United States. And so Tom got this big contract. And he sent to Japan for the initial client meetings Ron Brown. And he got this phone call from Tokyo and said, basically, reading between the lines, why are you sending us this black man? Right? We don't, we hired this law firm, we want you. And Boggs basically said, he is the finest young lawyer we have at the firm, and that's who you're going to get, so that's what your choice is, which is kind of a courageous thing. Fast forward, they loved Ron Brown. They were incredibly grateful that they had taken him on, and when Brown was tragically lost his life when his plane crashed in the Balkans War in Croatia, the Japanese government and the automobile industry sent a whole new array of cherry trees for the tidal basin honoring Ron Brown in Ron Brown's memory, so you can read that. Now, the reason that I mentioned this Ron Brown story at the end is that Marlon and I just attended a Ron Brown Scholar program, which is launched in his name. Ron had this saying that when your elevator gets to the top, don't forget to send it back down for other people. And he was a big believer in that and creating opportunity. You certainly are a big believer. You're doing so much during your career, mentoring other attorneys in-house, out-house, the work you're doing at RPI, both directly and indirectly, and the generous things you're doing to support this law school and to share your wisdom and experience with these students is really sending the elevator back down in a big way, and we're very, very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.